So, I have scratchy voice today. I woke not being able to have my regular voice, but I have my throat coat tea, and I believe I'm supposed to share some things with you. I don't want to leave you in the dark, and wow, there we go. I want to ask a question just to kick off. Is it more common, do you think, for most people to feel unworthy of the grace of God or to take God's grace for granted? I don't know if there's any way we can figure this out, but I'm just curious what you think. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. If you think more people feel unworthy, go ahead and raise your hand. About half, actually. And then if you think more people take it for granted, raise your hand. Maybe slightly more. This week, it just seemed like, the last couple of weeks actually, there's been a series of situations where people feeling stained, tainted, dirty, and unworthy, unforgiven has come up. 2 weeks ago when I was speaking after the service, someone said, I felt like there were 9 people in the room who were questioning their salvation. And then this past week, I had a friend say, somebody in a group say, I don't believe God can forgive me for that thing. And then I got this email shared with me. It was sent to Robert. The person gave permission. The person sent it to me also and gave permission to read it, part of it here. They wrote, I've often felt so divided in my affections that it will sometimes make me think, am I even really a Christian? Or if I wholeheartedly believe this, it wouldn't be so hard. At times, this juxtaposition of feelings has left me with so much shame and embarrassment that I think, what's the point? Living in God's grace without using it as a permission slip to live my life for me and my affections is something I often think about. And maybe you can relate, and I believe that perhaps more of us, or a bigger part of us, relates to that than maybe we even realize. But what if, this is what we're going to talk about today, what if it was possible at a deep, deep, deep level on the inside to know the love and the grace and the forgiveness of God that makes you clean, not without lowering Jesus' standard and justifying our disobedience, and not at all, but what if in a way that it was so overpowering that we couldn't help but live our lives like Jesus and do what he did for others? And I believe that's the passage, that's the encounter that we're going to look at today in John chapter 13. And so let me just set the stage, and then we'll begin. This is now for us 2 weeks out from Easter. This story is taking place the night before the crucifixion. This is the Last Supper. Jesus has had an incredible entry into Jerusalem a week before. The crowds were at a fever pitch of anticipation and expectation because they had these ancient prophecies that there was going to be a king, a deliverer, a rescuer, and he was going to free them from the yoke of oppression of the Roman people. And he was going to establish the reign and the rule of God that they've been longing and waiting for. Justice and righteousness would flow. And so when Jesus started doing his miracles and his teaching, they were like, he's the guy, it's happening. Well, the religious leaders, they were not so happy. They were growing in their antagonism, plotting his death. The disciples are just watching all of this unfold. There were these prophecies of the conquering king, but there were also prophecies of a suffering servant. And those were the ones that we often don't want to think about. We just want Jesus to come in and fix it and make it great. And he does, but the method of Jesus was first to fulfill his role as the suffering servant. And that's where we're picking up the story here at the Last Supper in John chapter 13. And let me begin here in verse 1. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father. So he knew that this was all according to plan, and this was going to be the end of things for him on this earth. It says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So here is Jesus at this Last Supper, about to show this ultimate expression of his love. And this is where I need you guys to help me out. I need 12 volunteers. We're going to be the disciples together, the apostles. So I get 12 men. If you could just stand up, grab a chair. Andy's over here helping. There's some on this side, some on this side. 12 courageous men. Thank you, David. Just 12. Thank you, Larry. Just please come on up. Chuck, yes. Rich, thank you. Seb, thank you. Johnny back here. Just until there's 12 guys, grab a chair and just form a row behind me. We're going to actually walk out what happened. So I don't think we got 12 yet, so thank you. Appreciate it. These guys are going to come on up. No need to be afraid of what's going to happen, but real quick, of the guys who are up here, got another, who's most likely to win in the TV show Fear Factor? Scrunch it a little closer here. Because whoever is most likely to win in Fear Factor needs to play the role of Jesus. Okay, it's me. I have long believed I'm made for the show Fear Factor. Do we have 12? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. We got it. Thanks, guys. Come on up. So I should mention that we did at a men's retreat a game that involved who could drink a, what's it called? Energy drink. Red Bull. Who could drink a Red Bull the fastest? So, a bunch of guys said, oh, me. And then we said, all right, come on up. Now take off your shoe and your sock and put the sock over the Red Bull. And that's how we're going to drink it. And guys were like, oh, no problem. It was rank with the socks. And then we said, pass it to the person on your right. And so, go. Guys, please remove your shoes and socks. Let me keep reading what happened here. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and they had come from God and was going back to God, Jesus rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and, taking a towel, tied it around his waist. And then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. Now, this is not how they would have looked, sort of seated in chairs. We've got a picture, actually, of one idea of what it might have looked like, that they were reclining at a table of some sort. And it says, Jesus got up from his position, he took off his shirt, and he took the posture of a servant. And I'm just going to step down here. In the ancient days, the roads were hot. It was a hot, arid culture. The roads were very, very dusty. And so it was quite common for your feet to look like this, the picture here. You came in to eat, and if you were going to the home or having a meal with somebody who had any measure of hospitality or affluence, there would be somebody, a servant or somebody else there, who would do the customary job of coming along and taking the basin, and go ahead if you just stick your feet in there, and beginning the process of just doing a quick rinse. It is cold, yes. But basically of just doing a quick rinse and washing of the feet and then drying them. And I need to mention that this is humbling to have somebody do this. It's also humbling to have somebody do it to you. Has anybody ever washed your feet? No. Okay, well, you're a courageous man if you want to stick your feet in that bowl there. You probably ought to get that looked at, Joe. But basically, what he was doing, and it's not unlike, if you've ever been on an airplane and you get to that point at the end of a long flight. They do this sometimes when you're flying overseas internationally, and they bring out the hot washcloth. Oh, man, it just feels so good. But Jesus is just working his way through his followers, through his disciples, and he's doing the thing. And at first, there may have been some jokes like, hey, bring out the pressure washer for me. Well, they didn't have pressure washers, but you know what I mean. There may have been some jokes along the way, but I think there was definitely a sobered seriousness to what was transpiring as Jesus was doing something that was deemed so humbling, so inappropriate for him to do. But it says he worked his way along, and who's Simon? Hold up your tags here. He worked his way along And he got to Simon, and Simon's like, "Nah, dog, I don't think so." Simon's like, "I'm not so sure." And Jesus is like, "No, you don't understand it now." I think we've got that scripture. He's like, "You don't understand yet what I'm doing for you. But this must be done. You'll understand later." And Simon's like, "No, I'm serious. You're not going to wash my feet." And Jesus says, "If you don't let me wash your feet, you have no part with me." And Simon's like, "Well, wash my whole body." He seriously is like, "Wash my whole body." And Jesus is like, "No, you don't understand. If you're already clean, you just need your feet to be washed." And so Jesus is doing this. He's making this moment, this experience with these guys. And he's doing it because he wanted to show them his love to the fullest. And he continued, it says, and he worked through all 12 of them. And I want to go back to that passage with Simon because he says something more. "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon says, "Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said, "The one who's bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." He didn't point him out at this moment. But do you understand that there was a knife in his back pocket? He's about to sink it into Jesus' back. Jesus could have done this foot washing later in just a little bit when Satan enters Judas. Jesus says, "What you must do, do quickly," and dismisses him. He could have saved the foot washing till Judas was gone. He knew what was going to happen with Peter. In a matter of hours, this friend, who was actually quite proficient in taking his feet and putting them in his mouth, Simon was about to deny Jesus. And Jesus calls that out later, but it didn't stop him from washing the feet. And so it says, when he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments, the rest of you guys can relax. No more foot washing here. He resumed his place and he said to them, "Do you understand what I've done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, for I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I've given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." So if you guys now could go ahead and put your shoes back on, socks back on. They're going to now come out into the audience and begin to wash your feet. Just kidding. Just kidding. Some of you are so mortified right now. We don't have a modern equivalent to foot washing. I mean, I was trying to come up with what that might look like in our culture. Like you go over to a friend's house and you go in and you go to use the restroom and it hasn't been cleaned and you wipe the toilet rim. I don't know. I couldn't come up. There is no modern equivalent to what happened in those days. Thank you, guys. And when you're done, you can just head back to your seats. I want to break down why Jesus did this. 2 reasons and 2 motivations. Number 1, Jesus did this because he wanted to show them his love to the most. The best way to elevate his love for them was to lower himself to serve them. The second reason he did this is he wanted to give them an example, a model, not just tell them what to do, but to show them what to do and to call them to turn around and do it with others. There were 2 motivations for this that he gave. 1, you call me teacher and Lord, right? Don't call me teacher and Lord if you're not going to do what I tell you to do. It's basically do it because I told you to do it. But then there's a second motivation here. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. I'm telling you to do it because I know what brings the greatest blessing. So Jesus calls these guys to begin a movement of radical, sacrificial, humble servitude to one another. Now, many Christians today practice this literally. A Maundy Thursday service, there's literal foot washings. I'm curious, did anybody grow up in a tradition where you did foot washing as part of your church? Not many here, perhaps, maybe a few. Others have taken this more figuratively, tangible acts of kindness and servitude, even to those we disagree with. Do you guys remember that controversial Super Bowl commercial the He Gets Us commercial. This year, the He Gets Us commercial had sort of slow-moving version of an INXS song with these series of photos like this of a fine art photographer, internationally known. This looks like a conservative, old school, you could say, family. The dad and the son with bleach blonde hair is there washing, and look at the expression on his face. The sister's just kind of like, oh boy, what's going on? Mom's like, oh, I'm just clearing the table. Go to the next one. Looks like a seedy motel, an abortion clinic, some protesters. Looks like maybe the woman on the ground has walked from the protesters up to this young girl. Look at the expression on her face. You wonder if perhaps she had just gone in and was coming out or was on her way in. The next one. This one gets me every time. Some of you grew up in that. Looks like a daughter has gone back to her mom in the midst of her brokenness. Together, they put their foreheads together. She washes her mom's dirty, contorted feet. Next one. Here you've got a suburban middle-class neighborhood and a couple watching. The two fathers watching on as the wife washes the feet of what looks to be a Muslim woman in Midwest America. And so these series of photographs were actually considered highly controversial for several reasons, actually. According to their website, their intent was in the midst of a highly inflammatory year of elections, in a politically charged, divisive environment, that they wanted to focus on one of the essence of Jesus' teaching, to love your neighbor. And they picked foot washing as an iconic way of expressing kindness and respect, even with people we disagree with. What I want to call our attention to is who Jesus called his disciples, whose feet Jesus called his disciples to wash. He didn't call them to wash Romans' feet. He didn't call them to wash Pharisees' feet. He called them to wash one another's feet, fellow followers of Jesus. I'm not saying he didn't call them also to live a life of sacrificial servitude, but in this passage, his focus was on washing the feet of fellow followers of Jesus Christ. And to make that super clear, look at verses 34 to 35. A new commandment I give you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Oh, he just means love one another as human beings. No, he doesn't, because he says, you are also to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. The distinguishing mark of a disciple is the expression of love that is shared with other people, and in this context, fellow disciples. And so that was meant to be a witness. How are we doing with this? Does the world look at Christianity, Christians, the church, and say, oh my gosh, they are so radically loving of one another. That looks awesome. Or does the world say, they're no different than we are. I don't want any part of that. And so this is sobering. I mean, we can't just kind of blow this off and move on. A lady came up to me after the service last night, and she said, I attend Saturday because I don't want to see somebody who attends Sunday morning. I said, well, I appreciate you sharing that. We'll see you next Sunday, right? I'm going to ask you the question, who don't you like here at LifeSpring? Don't answer that out loud. But does somebody come to mind? What kind of Christians bug you the most? Does something come to mind? What I see in Jesus is a call to love by tangible expressions of sacrificial servitude people in our midst that we don't naturally, intuitively want to love. It's shocking that Jesus washed feet. That's what a servant does. It's shocking that he washed the feet of Peter and Judas. It's shocking that he calls us to do that. But the most shocking thing of all It's what he said about being clean. How the one who has bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but is completely clean. It is shocking. You know why baptism is the marker of stepping into Christ? Many reasons, but you know one? It's symbolic. The water, what does water do? It cleanses us. Do you know how scandalous it is that God would so lower himself to become the toilet of our sin so that we could be cleansed, washed clean on the inside, to become clean in his sight? That's amazing. But here's the thing. Judas, he left with clean feet but a dirty heart. Peter, on the other hand, he's like, don't touch my feet. Peter had a clean heart, but his feet were dirty. And so here's the thing. It's possible to be loved by Jesus, but not forgiven by Jesus. Oh, please understand, he wants everybody to be forgiven. Love is unconditional, but forgiveness is not. Do you know that? Like, think about this with me for a minute. Does God automatically forgive everybody, or does the Bible say that we're called to turn, trust, and follow him? The only way you can be forgiven of sin is to agree with him that it is sin, and to turn from it to him and say, I need you to do what I can't do for myself. And this is, I think, I'm just questioning if I should say this. There is a pseudo-Christianity that tries to redefine sin, erase repentance, and say that because everybody's loved by God, nobody has to change. It's automatically deposited. And that's not what the Bible teaches. At the same time, Jesus' MO was not to come at any of us with a loaded gun. It was these radical, scandalous expressions of love. The woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery, and the basin and the towel. Jesus comes to you with a basin and a towel, and he wants to win you over by his unconditional love. But he won't make you be clean. He invites you to be clean. He gives you an invitation to be clean. But you're the one who has to say yes, who has to choose that, who has to accept it. And this is the idea, that we can be free from sin and shame. Every single one of us can be free from sin and shame. And we're won over by Jesus' unconditional love, but there's a choice we have in the process. We don't want to focus just on getting clean on the outside when our hearts are still marked by selfishness and pride. We need Jesus not just to clean up our outside, we need him to clean up our inside. And so this is, if you are the person who is struggling to believe that you could be clean, I would just say, have you turned to Jesus and said, you're right, I'm guilty. And thank you. I believe you did that for me. Have you been baptized? Have you said, I received the gift of salvation that is freely offered to everybody? If so, guys, you can live with this remarkable, astounding, confident conviction that you have a clean heart. Your feet get dirty. Please understand, Peter was about to go trip. He was about to screw up and mess up. But Jesus said, you've got a clean heart. You trust in me. And that's what makes you clean. And so the challenge for us is this: to turn, trust, and follow Jesus, preaching the gospel to ourselves every single day. And anytime I talk with somebody who feels like, I don't feel worthy, I said, well, tell me what your prayers sound like. And often they feel like, God, I don't feel worthy. And I said, is that it? And they're like, yeah. I was like, all right, well, you need to learn how to preach the gospel to yourself. What do you mean preach the gospel to yourself? Well, how do you preach it to someone else? You preach the gospel to someone else who says, I feel ashamed, I feel sad, I feel afraid. I'm like, okay, hey, there's good news. Did you know that Jesus, through his life, I'm looking at you, Dean. Did you know, Dean, and this is what you do to yourself. You say, Jeff, Jesus died so that you could be free from feeling guilty and ashamed. He wants to cleanse you. And so confess your sin and claim the forgiveness that he offers. And the good news of Jesus is not just for when you're feeling guilty, it's when you're feeling afraid. The good news of Jesus is he's coming back and he's going to right this world with all of its wrongs. And he's going to set us free from all of this pain and disappointment and hurt that we feel. And so when you're feeling sad, when you're grieving, when the pain is so high, preach the good news of Jesus to yourself. Jesus, through his life, his death, and his resurrection, gives you a new identity, a new purpose, and a new destiny. You can know that you will be with him forever and that he is going to wipe away every last tear and every last pain in your heart. It's why we sing these songs when we gather together in worship. We're declaring this over and over. The more we confess our sin and claim our forgiveness, the less we doubt. Preaching the good news to yourself is not saying I feel unworthy. It's saying I feel unworthy, but I trust what you've done for me. And so that's the challenge and that's the call. And you know what happens when you do that? All of a sudden you feel like you're just living in a perpetual restart with God. You just feel like, oh my gosh, this is awesome. This is like, I want other people to experience this too. You can't preach the good news to anybody else if you don't feel it for yourself. And so if you're struggling with the motivation to share because you feel unworthy, preach the gospel to yourself. Preach the good news of Jesus to yourself. And what's going to happen is we're not going to be able to hold you back from telling it to other people. It's what I'm doing. I wanted to share this with you. Jesus is so good, guys. He wants to clean us inside and out. The second challenge for us is for others, and it's to follow Jesus' example of loving and serving others, including those who hurt us, who fail us in the church. And so here's, I think, the challenge with this. I think for some of us, we have created a mental block that this idea of radical sacrificial love for people who are different or who I don't like doesn't apply in this situation. Well, you don't know what he did, or you don't know what she did, or you don't know what they said. And I think what Jesus is trying to say is that's not the case. We need to all stretch and grow ourselves to be more like him. And we never arrive, you know? Here are 3 practical ways that we can wash feet figuratively by Jesus. Number 1, get connected in a smaller group of people who are also seeking to follow Jesus. We can kind of wash each other's feet here on a Sunday service, but not really. I really appreciate the people who have prepared the cafe. Thank you. I appreciate the people who put the time in. That was an act of servitude. Was it radical and sacrificial? Maybe for you. You're an introvert and scary. You don't love coming to be in crowds of people, but you do it because you love and you want to build up and serve. Awesome. That's a foot washing. But I would say most of what we do here in this service is not necessarily foot washing. Random, intermittent, sporadic good deeds is not going to get the attention of the world. They're going to see us when we deeply and authentically live out love in smaller, diverse groups. So step 1 is get in a group. And so here's what I want you to do. Just right now, close your eyes. Just right now, close your eyes. And I want you to picture the faces of the brothers and sisters. If you're a follower of Jesus, picture the faces of your brothers and sisters that you are regularly living life with, on mission with Jesus. Think of their names. These are people that you're meeting with regularly, not people you see from across a room. If you can't picture, you can open your eyes. If you can't picture their faces and their names, this is your next step to become somebody who loves like Jesus. You've got to get connected in a smaller group of people where we can do this and live this out. That's why we as a church say that the second most important thing we can do is get you connected in Christian community. Smaller groups. You can't live out Christian community attending a service alone. And you know what the number one thing is? To get you reading and reflecting on the Bible, to hear and obey it. That's number one. But number two is to do it in a smaller community. And we can help you with that. If you don't have a connection, just take a Connect card and put it on there. We can come alongside and help you get plugged in. This is number two. Make sure you include people who aren't like you, perhaps who frustrate and annoy you. If the group of people that you thought of are your best friends, that you're just people who are naturally the people you love to hang out with, you got to change that up a bit. You're never going to be able to wash feet like Jesus did with people that you naturally and inherently and instinctively and intuitively love. Because here's the thing, the kind of Christ-like love that we're talking about can only exist where it doesn't inherently exist. And so you've got to find yourself around people who are different, that maybe rub you the wrong way or just look at the world differently. It's why you got to have an open door and you got to have an open seat to include people in and not put up walls and barriers and cherry pick just the people you like. That is not the way of Jesus. It's happening again. It happened last night. I just was so overwhelmed. It's not the way of Jesus to pick who you're going to love in the sense of you, but not you, but you, but not you. Jesus' love was inclusive, and that's what he calls us to. The third thing is up your intentionality. Sometimes people feel like, I don't feel like I could ever love that radically. Other people feel like, oh, I'm doing it. And I would say those are two extremes that we could both fall into. And this is what's important, upping your intentionality. So this is a Dodge Challenger SRT Demon 170. Apparently this thing goes from 0 to 60 in 1.66 seconds. That's awesome. The A-Spark Owl in 1.72 seconds. The Radical RXC GT, 2.7 seconds. Your 2020 Honda Accord, 6-cylinder, 8 seconds. And my truck, Billy, poor guy, he's never quite made it to 60 yet. But what's my point? When I'm talking about radical, sacrificial, wash the feet of Judas kind of love, I'm saying don't try and go from 0 to 60, go from 0 to 1, or from 12 to 13, or from 48 to 49. Everybody's got a different natural aptitude for this. Some people have inherited a lot more brokenness. And this is the thing that the world doesn't see. I need to say this too. If you're somebody who feels like, thank you, Jeff, for putting a finger on the reason why I don't want to be a part of organized expressions of Christianity. Oh, I believe in Jesus. I even try to follow Jesus. I just don't want anything to do with the church because of all the pain. Well, first of all, you're not a follower of Jesus if you disassociate from the church. So let's make that clear. And second, the world, when it points a finger and says, oh, you call yourself a Christian? Well, you don't know. Joe, you realize what Joe would be like if he didn't have Jesus? Yeah, he's got some rough edges. Yeah, he's got some weaknesses. Yeah, he does some stuff wrong. But man, if he didn't have Jesus, he would be like way farther. So the goal here is progression. We're seeking to become more like Jesus and not settle and be stagnant. When was the last time you felt that sting and burn of pushing yourself to love sacrificially? If you can't think of it, you need to up your intentionality. And I've got some examples for how we do that. If you're somebody who never encourages anybody, just say an encouraging word. And if you're like, oh my gosh, I do that all the time, not only do it more often, but do it with someone who never does it to you. And then do it with someone that you know is talking bad about you to others, and zip your lip to talk about them to other people. There is something here for everybody at every stage. We got the radical and we got Billy, and all of us can move forward. What about this one? Just ask how somebody's doing. And doggone it, just listen, like really listen. And when you walk away, if you want to stretch, if that's hard for you, the next stretch might be to just make a little note in your phone and to pray for that person later. And then to actually, the next time you meet them, ask, hey, how's that going? You mentioned that thing. And then to actually say, could I pray with you? There's a stretch here for all of us to increase our intentionality. Invite somebody out to lunch. Invite someone you don't necessarily want to have lunch with out to lunch. Keep inviting them when they never invite you back. This last one might be the toughest one. You get in a squabble with your husband or your wife or your friend, and you're like, I'm going to wait. What they said, that was so hurtful. I'm going to wait till they come back, and then maybe I'll be willing to forgive them and move forward. Well, maybe you're the first person to make the first move. And you're like, yeah, but no, quit the buts. This is washing feet. You go first and reach out. And then if you're like, okay, I do that. Well, shorten your response time. You know, if it takes you a couple hours. The other day, I was kind of struggling, and it took me some time. And God convicted me, make the first move. And I was like, I'm mad. I don't want to pray with Julie tonight. We always pray. Every night we pray. And God was like, don't go to bed mad. Don't skip that. And so it took me a little time, but we did. And the next morning, we were able to work through it. Well, I wish I would have worked through it that night fully. We prayed together, and I said, let's talk tomorrow. But, I wish I would have stayed up longer and later that night to work through it. So there's something here for all of us. What about that estranged family member who hurt you deeply? What about that person at the Saturday night service? You never attended, even though you'd rather. You attend this one to avoid them. Stretch yourself. It takes supernatural. The band, you guys can come on up. It takes supernatural love to do this. But here's the thing. It's hard, but it is possible. And I love Jesus' example. It says it here that Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and they had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. Do you see what made it possible for Jesus to kneel down and wash their feet? He was secure in his identity. He knew what his Father thought of him. He knew where he came from, and he knew what was around the corner, the glory that awaited. And when you know that you are loved and forgiven by God the Father, when you know where he's taking you, how glorious it is, there is no depth to which you cannot kneel. There is no puddle of vomit that you cannot clean up. There is no knife that could be about to be plunged in your back that will not melt and dissolve by divine supernatural love. At the very end of this passage, it says, when he had gone out, Jesus said, now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once. What's all this glory, glorification, glory stuff? Jesus was glorified. See what it says? Now. At once. Jesus wasn't just glorified on Easter Sunday when he was resurrected. He was glorified with the dirt on his hands, with the towel wiping their feet. And we too, guys, knowing that we're loved by God, thank you, God, I receive this. I don't always feel like I deserve it, but I receive it. Whew. Okay, I can do this. We'll find ourselves able to kneel down. And what Jesus said will be true of us. We will be blessed, not just if we know it, but if we do it. And we will actually be glorified like Jesus in taking up the basin and the towel. Why don't you stand to your feet? Lord, I just thank you for this encouraging, challenging word. Help us to take our next step. What is it, God? What is it? What's my next step? How can I increase my intentionality to receive your grace and forgiveness and to show it to others? You see what he says right now. I won't be able to do it without you. Jesus, I know it was not easy for you to wash Judas's feet. You were deeply troubled when you did that. It was painful, but possible for you and for us. And so may your power create this unstoppable force of divine love, break through the barriers in us and break through the barriers that hold us back and handcuff us to love one another as you have loved us. Amen.